Well, welcome to Briefing. What does the Bible, slaughtering pigeons, and menstruation have in common? Well, actually, quite a lot, which is today's topic for briefing training. Let me ask a question. If somebody was giving a speech to a group of women and they said that their natural functioning of their body, their period of menstruation, made them unclean, and it made the things that they touched unclean, and it made the things that they sat on unclean, and their formula for becoming clean again would be to go visit the priest at the temple and have the priest slaughter 2 pigeons and then take the carcass of the second pigeon and light it on fire. What would be your opinion of somebody who said that to a group of women? Well, interestingly enough, it's God who says that. If we study the 15th chapter of Leviticus, and if we also study the book of Ezekiel, as well as Luke's nativity narrative, we'll find out that these things are in the Bible quite frequently, and often enough, it's God who's actually saying them. So as we talk about these passages, keep an idea or a thought in mind. Is this truly the Word of God? Or is this the writings of an ancient and superstitious people who did not fully understand the workings of the human body and were coming up with ceremonies in order to reconcile their fears and their superstitions about what they were observing but did not understand? The 15th chapter of Leviticus starts out with what happens with men when they have an abnormal penile discharge. Now, having been a man my whole life, the only normal things to come out of a penis are urine and, on occasion, semen or ejaculate. Both of those things the man has some control over. As far as an abnormal penile discharge would be an indication of some type of health problem, possibly a sexually transmitted disease. That would require medical care to take care of. In the 15th chapter of Leviticus, it specifically talks about abnormal penile discharges, and the formula for becoming clean again is to slaughter 2 pigeons and light the carcass of the second pigeon on fire, as well as washing everything down with water, and at one point even mentions washing the hands with water, which would be an excellent idea, and I don't really have much complaint about that. The next very short section is about men who ejaculate on themselves. What they ejaculate on makes that thing unclean. It makes the man who ejaculated unclean, and everything must be washed down with water and wait 7 days before that man is clean again. In Leviticus chapter 15, starting at verse 19, the ancient Israelites are given their rules for women and menstruation. It's important to note that the language that's used by the author of writing these particular ceremonies that must be followed. The author writes that women during their menstruation and within 7 days after their menstruation are unclean, that they have an impurity. Specifically, the word impurity is used. That if they touch things, that those things will become impure as well. And that women can spread this impurity simply by touching things, sitting on things, or having sex with someone. At verse 29, God, in his conversation with Aaron and Moses, starts to explain what happens when a woman has an irregular menstrual period. This is actually quite common in speaking to the women in my old life and reading up on, medical journals about this, that an irregular period can be brought on by all kinds of things. Stress, a change in diet, some kind of an illness, the flu, cold, a variety of things. It's important to note the language that's specifically used by the ancient author. Again, an irregular flow of menstruation is unclean, and it's an impurity. The formula for becoming clean again is specifically stated as slaughtering 2 pigeons, but the first pigeon that is slaughtered is said to be a sin offering, giving some kind of indication that the woman has done something wrong based on the natural functioning of her body. The second pigeon to be slaughtered is a burnt offering. This is a pigeon that you light on fire after slaughtering it. By verse 29, the formula is completed and the woman is clean again. But it's interesting to note the verbiage that is used in this particular verse is to say that the woman has made atonement for her uncleanliness and her impurity. An atonement has to do with doing something wrong, committing some type of a sin. And this is the exact terminology that the author chose to use. So it really should be no surprise to anyone that an ancient superstitious author might come up with ceremonies like this and eventually write them down in ancient books. That makes perfect sense. But what doesn't really make sense is that the idea that the omniscient creator of the universe, the creator of the female body, inspired man to write these stories down as some type of effort to communicate a message to all of mankind. That idea is ludicrous. Moving on to the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is probably one of the most sexually violent books in the entire Bible. Chapter 16, verse 6, interestingly enough, has God noticing a young girl, and he specifically comments on the developing breasts and the growth of her pubic hair. In chapter 23, verse 8, describes a story of powerful military and government men raping a woman and then ejaculating on her, only to later stab her to death with swords. The book of Ezekiel, the author starts out every chapter with writing, "The word of the Lord came to me," kind of indicating that this is some type of divine dictation, that the word of the Lord is speaking directly to the author of Ezekiel, and the author is writing down what the Lord is telling him. Chapter 18, verse 6 of Ezekiel lists the qualities of a righteous man. One of the qualities of a righteous man, according to the author of Ezekiel, is not to sleep with a woman when she's on her monthly menstruation period. Chapter 22, verse 10 of Ezekiel. The author is giving an angry rant as to the sins of Jerusalem at the time. And he's talking about or writing about how the people have become violent, how they've become promiscuous, and how they're defiling and living in an ungodly way. And the author writes, like a woman who is on her monthly menstruation period. In chapter 36 of Ezekiel, between verses 16 and 19, it's talking about the Israelite people who have defiled their land through their conduct and their impurity, like a woman who's impure because of her monthly menstruation. Interestingly enough, this ideology also gets into Luke's nativity narrative of Jesus' birth. After Jesus is born, Mary goes through a purification process and waits 8 days. After her purification is completed, she goes to the temple where the priest slaughters 2 pigeons because she has birthed a healthy baby boy. These stories are wrong. The slaughtering of pigeons would have absolutely no effect on the male or the female human body. They're based on ignorant superstitions. The authors were simply mistaken. It's really not enough to say that these stories aren't true. They're actually offensive.